And the CCVA has been the home of our professional ethics for many years. There are two handouts related to this session that I'll refer to as we move through the slides, and they are also going to be available via links in the chat box, and Dean's going to pop them in there, and we will also send them to you after the session. And they're also available on the CVA website, which is cvacert.org. So we are going to be using Menti just a little bit today. If you have never used Menti before, you can go to menti.com, either on another window or another screen, or even on your smartphone, which is what I usually do. I'll give you a minute just to pop over to menti.com right now, and then add in the code 13591481. And I'll say that again if anyone needs that. So it's menti.com, and just pop in the code 13591481. You can follow along the slides on the Menti side as well, but we will be using it just a little bit today. So my name is Faiza Venzant. I'm the Executive Director for the Council for Certification in Volunteer Administration. I've been a CVA, which stands for Certified in Volunteer Administration, since 2016. And if you wanted to find out more about what it takes to become a CVA and to earn this professional credential, I welcome you to join us at an information session. And you can join us for one of our free information sessions by going to cvacert.org/info. And Dean, if you want to pop that link into the chat box, you can go there right now and sign up for one of our information sessions if you want to find out a little bit more about becoming a CVA. So today we're going to be talking about ethics, and I'm going to start you off with a case study. Oh, actually, before we get to the case study, I want to tell you just a little bit more about the CVA credential. The CVA exam that Dean is going to be writing in April, and I know there's a couple other people that have joined us today that are also going to be taking the exam. And hello to any CVAs that are also out there. I do see a few of you. The CVA exam is based on the CCVA's 7 competencies of volunteer administration, which are planning for strategic volunteer involvement, advocating for volunteer involvement, attracting and onboarding a workforce of volunteers, preparing volunteers for their roles, documenting volunteer involvement, managing volunteer performance and impact, and acknowledging, celebrating, and sustaining volunteer involvement. All things that I'm sure sound really familiar to all of you. So I want to ask you, in terms of the competencies that we test our candidates on, what competency can you claim as a current strength of yours? Are you a strategic architect? Are you an articulate ambassador, a relationship builder, a talent cultivator, a data manager, champion of quality, a passionate leader? If you go into Menti right now, where you went before, you can choose one of these. I'm sure many of you would be able to pick all 7, but just pick one for now. And let's see who is joining us today. So I see lots of relationship builders, passionate leaders, and definitely must be passionate if you are attending a session on ethics. And so really glad that you're here today. Some champions of quality, super important when you're working with community and working and partnering with volunteers as well. Excellent. So I'm sure that for some of you, there are other competencies that you want to claim as a current strength as well. In order to be a CVA, you demonstrate competency and knowledge in all 7 of these areas. And so I wish all of our CVA candidates good luck with the April exam coming up, and hi once again to all the CVAs who are here. All right. So today we're going to be talking about professional ethics in volunteer administration. I'm going to tell you a little bit about Lynn. Lynn is a real person whose name is not Lynn, but we've protected her by giving her a different name for this case study. And this is a real case study from the summer of 2021. I want you to think about Lynn as we go through today's content, and we will come back and visit Lynn's situation after we've talked about what the core values and principles of the professional ethics and volunteer administration are. And then we've gone through a tool, a decision-making process that would help us to understand how we could approach ethical dilemmas. We'll come back to Lynn. So Lynn is the director of volunteer services in a hospital setting. And Lynn's been asked by senior management to organize a COVID vaccination clinic for volunteers based on her government's current phasing criteria. The vaccination supply is not guaranteed. So while determining which volunteers meet the current age and medical criteria, Lynn is approached by the Vice President of Development. He instructs her to invite one of the hospital's largest donors, Mrs. Smith, to be vaccinated. When Lynn comments that the clinic is only for current volunteers, the VP says, Mrs. Smith has dedicated lots of time to causes on behalf of the hospital. And the hospital really can't afford to disappoint her. Lynn knows Mrs. Smith doesn't meet the current age requirement for vaccination and is unsure of her medical background. What should Lynn do? So we'll come back and revisit Lynn's situation. I want to start a little bit with some historical context and some context, history and background for professional ethics and volunteer administration. So ethics is something that has been talked about and written about for centuries. It's only been during the last 50 years or so that we've connected it to the field of volunteerism. It's one of the defining characteristics of any profession. And the first statement of ethics in volunteer administration was developed in the 1970s as a way for practitioners to signal to their colleagues and their organizations that they took this work very seriously. Later on, this early document was updated and it was revised by AVA, the Association for Volunteer Administration, based on the work of Michael Josephson, an international expert in the field of ethics. One thing that I've learned while doing this work in volunteer engagement is that often it's our colleagues in healthcare who are able to surface things that we can look at in terms of professionalizing what we do because of the various credentialed professionals that they work with. So within the hospital sector, for example, there were directors of volunteers in hospitals who really used the professional ethics of volunteer administration when they were working side by side with their medical professional colleagues, doctors, radiologists, phlebotomists, all those medical professionals who also had a code of ethics. And it really helped them to signal to their colleagues, that we're also part of a profession and we also have a set of ethics that we abide by. So AVA had to dissolve in 2006 due to a severe financial crisis. And in order to preserve the previous work related to ethics in volunteer administration, the ownership of this material was transferred to CCVA, which is where I currently work. The material was again updated in 2016 just to ensure that it remains relevant and that it's something that could still be used by practitioners and educators. If you're not familiar with CCVA, we sponsor the International Certified in Volunteer Administration credential for our field, and applicants to the CVA program are required to affirm their commitment to professional ethics. And those who go on to become CVAs are required to affirm this commitment every 5 years. CCVA strongly encourages practitioners like you to apply an ethical lens when working with volunteers. However, we don't play an enforcer role or a policing type of role when it comes to ethics. So we're not watching what you're doing and we're not going to come down on you and say, you didn't do this right. You lose the right to be a leader of volunteers. Rather, what we're hoping to do and what I'm hoping is an outcome of today is that we make information and tools available to you to support you and to encourage you to make ethical decisions and to hopefully help you when you come across an ethical dilemma so that it's easier for you to make those decisions as you come across those dilemmas. All right, Judy is asking if I can increase my volume. I'm going to put it up as high as I can and maybe move a bit closer. I'm hoping that helps you, Judy. So let's consider the word ethics as we move around. How would you define it? So for me, it's something that when I say it, I know what it means. Um, and I can use it in conversation in terms of talking about it from a very personal standpoint. But sometimes it can be hard to explain to other people, and it can feel complicated. So on the screen, you'll see some other words that are often used when we are thinking about or talking about ethics. So some of these words are more associated with individuals, like morals and beliefs, okay? And then some of them are more applicable to groups and organizations, like policies, for example, or culture. And a word like values could really go either way. Um, all of these terms, they really do represent important concepts and rules that we can't ignore, especially when we're working within certain cultures. And they might mean different things to different people, and that can be something that's very confusing at times. And it can also be something that is overwhelming when it comes down to a more practical application of ethics in the real world. And so, what do I mean by that? Let's start with a really simple idea. Second. When we think about our morals, our beliefs, and our values, and when we think about, all the people that we come into contact with every day, it's easy for us to know where maybe our morals and our beliefs and our values might intersect when we think about it from a personal level. When we think about it from an organizational level, right, and we're thinking about ourselves either as staff or volunteers, sometimes members or clients of an organization, it's the policies and the cultures that help to guide sometimes, what might be the reason why we do something, or why we make a certain decision. Okay. So when it comes to ethics, one of the things that I would love to know from you is, as a leader of volunteers, um, do you have a clear understanding of the professional ethics of volunteers? Do you feel confident in your ability to work through ethical decision making? Or do you want to strengthen your skills as they relate to professional ethics and volunteer administration? So take a minute just to pop your answer into Menti so I can get a sense of how people are feeling about the topic of ethics. Um, and that will sort of help me to just help guide me in terms of the detail that I'll be providing. Great. We have quite a few people who are looking to strengthen their skills as they relate to professional ethics. I love seeing that there are people that are confident in their ability to work through ethical decision making. And then hopefully today, for those of you, this is just exercising that moral courage, right? And exercising what ethical decision making is all about, which is always important to be doing. We don't face ethical dilemmas on a daily basis, but we do need to exercise our moral courage and our ability to make decisions regularly so that when we're faced with an ethical dilemma, we know what to do. Okay, great. Thank you for sharing. So let's start with a very simple idea that hopefully each of us can understand. I want you to think of ethics as a backpack that each of us carries with us, okay? Maybe it's not a backpack that you carry. Maybe you have a rolly suitcase. Maybe you have a crossbody. Maybe you have a clutch or a briefcase, whatever it is that you carry. Think of your ethics and think of the fact that each of us carries an ethic backpack, okay? Your ethic backpack is part of you, um, and it's part of you, and it influences how you behave. Your ethics are deeply personal, um, and they're deeply unique. Your backpack is unique to you, and my backpack is unique to me. I may have some of the same contents in my backpack as you have in yours, but there's going to be other content that's very different. And it's really important for us to understand this when we're doing work around professional ethics and volunteer administration, because we can never assume that one person's backpack is going to be the same as our own. And that's really important to understand, because what that means is that when we're making an ethical decision, I can't assume, right, that the decision that I arrive at is going to be the same as yours, but we are hopefully using the same set of values and principles, and we're hopefully using a similar process to get us there. Okay. So think of that as the backpack. And if you need to visualize it, just think about the fact that I carry one and that you carry one. There are hopefully things in our backpacks that are the same, but there are things that are different, and that's something to appreciate about each other. And that's something to appreciate about our profession as well. So, what's in that ethics backpack? Okay. In our ethics backpack, you'll find your organizational ethics, you'll find your personal ethics, and you'll find your professional ethics. So your personal ethics are just that, right? They're yours, they're very subjective, they're influenced by your history, by your experience, your religious beliefs, perhaps, your ethnicity, your culture. They can be influenced by where you live in the world, in proximity to certain communities or not. They can be influenced by something that I'm learning as someone that's new to the United States. I live in between two very big military bases, and I'm learning that for a lot of people, a lot of my neighbors in my new community here, their military service or being part of a family where someone has military service influences their ethics as well. And even amongst them, there's a lot of diversity in their personal ethics. Your personal ethics are what guides your immediate reaction to a situation. So, what I mean by that is your personal ethics are that internal voice that says, when something happens, it says, like, no, that's not right. That doesn't feel right. Okay. For me, that's something that I feel viscerally, right? Like when something doesn't feel right for me, I immediately feel it in my stomach. And I have colleagues that will say, I get flush in my face or I break out into a sweat. Okay. And I have my husband I'll see him getting really fidgety. Okay. And that's when you know that something is not right with your personal ethics. It's that visceral gut initial reaction. Oftentimes it can be physical. Okay. So, because of your personal ethics, doing the right thing, it may mean something different for me than it means for you. Okay. So, I don't know if you've ever been in a meeting or, in a group setting where somebody says something and for you, you have a reaction to it, right? So, for me, I feel it in the pit of my stomach. But then as I look around the room at all of my colleagues, I notice nobody else seems to be having a reaction and everyone else is kind of nodding along. And that is, to me, a real signal that there's something that's happening or something that's been said that I'm reacting to that maybe everybody else is not to. It's a signal for me to stop for a second, think about what I'm hearing, and think about how I'm feeling in that moment as well, and just acknowledge that the way I'm feeling and the reaction that I'm having is very personal. Okay. So that's your personal ethics. Your organizational ethics are a set of principles that govern the behavior of a group of people. And it's often called in an organization a code of ethics or guiding values. Those might be other words that are being used. So lots of not-for-profits and businesses will have these posted on their wall. Some people have them on their websites. When I worked at the YMCA of Greater Toronto, we used to have them on our business cards. There's something that we are proud of and that we make sure that we want our stakeholders to understand and to know. So the purpose of organizational ethics is that you want to ensure consistency around action rather than leaving decisions up to people to behave with a reaction of their personal ethics. Okay. When we join an organization as an employee or when we join as a volunteer, we agree. Sometimes we're asked to sign a code of ethics or a policy document. And we're agreeing when we do that to abide by the values and the rules of that organization. Your current organization where you work or where you volunteer, it may have a code of ethics or values, and you might want to take some time just to take a look at it and to compare it to the contents of what we're going to be discussing today, which is the professional ethics. So that's also in your backpack. So the professional ethics of volunteer administration and professional ethics that are in your backpack. And for some of us, we're leaders of volunteers, but we may also have another hat that we wear. We may be fundraisers as well. We may be medical professions as well. We may work in animal welfare, for example. We may have more than one set of professional ethics. So professional ethics are values and principles that apply to a specific field of activity. So there's obvious examples of that: doctors, lawyers, accountants, fundraising professionals, human resource professionals, and us as well as leaders of volunteers. our professional ethics define a foundation for practice that is universally applicable no matter the setting. Okay. So whether you work in food insecurity, whether you work at a museum, whether you work in a healthcare setting, whether you work for a sporting organization, your professional ethics are applicable no matter the setting. Okay. So if you think of a doctor, for example, whether a doctor is working in a private practice or a free clinic, or overseas helping another community, their professional ethics are the same no matter the context. So for all of us, regardless of where we practice as leaders of volunteers, our professional ethics are the same. And that's what we're going to focus on today, the ethics in volunteer administration. Okay, so with all of that in our backpack, is it any surprise that sometimes there's a conflict? Okay, hopefully there's a great deal of overlap between these three realms in our backpack. But sometimes we are going to encounter situations where the values in one area of your backpack conflict with your values in another part of your backpack. And then we're faced with a difficult decision, right? And we have to think to ourselves, like, which of my ethics am I going to honor? Which ones can I compromise? And this is why ethical dilemmas occur and why they can be so hard to navigate. Okay, let's pop back into menti.com. And if you just joined us, we're using Menti as a way to crowdsource information and for us to share really quickly with each other what we're sharing. Okay, so you're going to go to menti.com either in another window or I use my smartphone. You can open up a browser there and you're going to add the code 13591481. And the question is, can you describe any scenarios or lived experiences where your personal and your organizational ethics might have been in conflict? Okay. And just take a minute to pop that into Menti, not all at once now. So take a minute to describe any scenarios or lived experiences where your personal and organizational ethics might have been in conflict. Right, so we see making decisions around COVID screening. Okay, someone says, I haven't run into this yet. This is great. When you do, hopefully the tools that we talk about today and the process that we talk about is helpful. Utilization of volunteers to fill staff vacancies. Yeah, I'm familiar with that. My organization says they are committed to diversity, but there is non-action. Okay. The pandemic frequently created challenges with this, particularly in regards to visitation access to patients. Yes. Making exceptions for reimbursements. Being a parent of students in school, sometimes the curriculum didn't match what I would teach my kids at home. Yes, this is actually something in California that we are going through as well, with lots of different parts of education. Just pop up here. The pandemic, volunteers being overly familiar with their small talk to others, asking about marital status and making comments on appearance. Folks were not comfortable, but that were not comfortable, but that could be considered small talk elsewhere. Yep. Alcohol served at a volunteer appreciation for social services. That is a great one. And if your organization doesn't have a policy around alcohol, this is something that I frequently think about. I'm not someone who drinks a lot. I don't care if other people do. But I know that for people to which this is really important to them, it is an equity issue and it's a diversity issue. When you think about how many times we get together socially in a work situation and there's alcohol involved, and what that might feel like for someone who doesn't consume alcohol for whatever reason it is. For me, I just don't like the taste of it. Give me a Coke Zero any day. All right, asking volunteers to fill roles for staff. People stand for election, but reveal much later their service as a volunteer is conditional. Excellent. having volunteers back during COVID and not sure if it's feeling safe, friends and family of staff bypassing screening procedures to become volunteers. Yes, this happens. This example comes up in every time I do this session. So um, ageism towards volunteers, another one that's excellent. Staff in our program partnering with community police officers, and we're going to have them help at an event alongside volunteers I was to recruit. And this person says, I support defunding the police. Such an interesting one as well. If you think about, for some of us, the communities that we serve, right? There may be communities that we serve who as a whole don't have a great affinity towards police. And what does it say when we invite police to be part of our organizations, especially when we invite them to come and volunteer and represent and be a face at our organizations. Asking staff to volunteer but making them feel pressured, having to enforce pandemic restrictions, for example masking, and then organizational leaders posting unmasked photos in disregard of policies we have to enforce. Alcohol served at an event with youth participants. Yep, poverty tourism versus actually helping our community. Excellent. Thank you all so much for popping your examples in. So you did a really great job of describing scenarios where your lived experiences um, show that there was a conflict between your personal and your organizational ethics. So excellent. We're going to focus on the professional ethics and also give ourselves as practitioners a way to identify when something is an ethical dilemma, and then a decision-making process to go forward. And so if you find your personal and your professional in conflict, if you find your professional and your organizational in conflict, you may find all three of those contents of your backpack in conflict. And so hopefully these tools will help you. Thank you. So now that we understand those three types of ethics that are in our backpack, I want to look a little bit more closely at what are the professional ethics. So this slide shows the 5 core values for volunteer engagement professionals. They are, and I use the word craft because I think of what we do as a craft and as a practice, and craft helps me to remember the core values. So C is for citizenship, R is for respect, A, accountability, F, fairness, and T is trust. You might wonder where these came from and how they were decided, and they're based on a very well-known framework used by many professions, not just ours. So years ago, the well-known Josephson Institute for Ethics conducted extensive international research, and they asked people everywhere, what are your core values? Josephson called these the pillars of character. And these universal values became the basis for creating a common set of ethical principles. And they can be applied when we're thinking about, what's the right thing to do in a situation. Many professions have developed their code of ethics or their guiding values based on these core values. And the Association for Volunteer Administration, they used Josephson's work as the framework for the original work done on ethics for volunteer engagement. In 2016, CCVA revised this process with a task force, revisited the earlier core values, and that resulted in this set that you see here of craft, okay? The next few slides, we're gonna quickly go through what each of those 5 core values means. And they're also available in a one-page handout that Dean's gonna pop into the chat box. They're also available on our website. You're also going to get these slides after today's session. So don't feel like you have to write everything down. I'm also going to make sure you have all of these after today's session as well. All right, so let's start with citizenship, okay? So citizenship means that we as the practitioners understand that volunteerism is the foundation of civil societies, okay? And it's important to make that distinction between civil societies because for some of us, we may work in or volunteer in more grassroots, organic communities that have a different sense or understanding of what volunteerism is, okay? So this is an understanding that volunteerism is a foundation of civil societies and guides an organization and its stakeholders towards active community participation. So we're thinking about more formal structures, right, where there's hierarchies, there's stakeholders, and we're thinking about it in that way. Each of the values that we're going to go through for craft has three principles that inform that value. And so for citizenship, philosophy of volunteerism is one of those principles. And that means that for me, it means that for me as a practitioner, I maintain a clear personal philosophy on volunteerism. I'm very clear on what volunteerism means to me, and I have a personal philosophy that guides my practice, and has guided my practice for the last 23 years that I've been in this field. And that I'm open to the fact that my personal philosophy can change when I have information that I didn't have before, and when I learn about volunteerism and continue to learn about volunteerism. So we use that personal philosophy of volunteerism to support our organization's development of a philosophy around volunteer engagement as well. And if your organization doesn't have a philosophy around volunteer involvement, I would encourage you as the leader of volunteers to take your organization down that path and to really develop what that is, right? Really develop what is your organization's philosophy on volunteerism, and then how are you going to live that philosophy. For many of us, we have what a definition of a volunteer is, because we try to define it in difference to what a staff person is or what a donor is, but that doesn't necessarily speak to what our philosophy of volunteerism is. Okay. The next principle that informs that is social responsibility. So social responsibility means that as practitioners, we can facilitate a compassionate and a caring culture. And we do this so that community needs are met and shared values are enhanced, right? So we have a responsibility beyond our role as a staff within an organization, or as a leader of volunteers within an organization. And everything that we do, our social responsibility relates back to the community that we serve. Some of us might say to the clients that we serve, or the members that we serve, or the environment, or the animals that we might serve. And then lastly, it's philanthropy, which means that we cultivate a model, and we cultivate and we model a generosity of spirit and time and resources. And again, we do this to further volunteer engagement so that we can meet community needs, right? So we're always thinking about and centering the community that we serve first and foremost through the work that we do. All right, so next in craft, after C is the R, and R stands for respect. So we acknowledge the inherent values, skills, and abilities of everyone, and we affirm the mutual benefit that is gained by volunteers and by us, right? So it's not just about what we get from volunteers being involved in our organizations, but what is the benefit to the volunteer as well. So this value of respect is informed by three principles: dignity, inclusivity, and privacy. And dignity means that we act compassionately. We uphold the right of volunteers to be valued and to be involved in decisions that affect them. For me, involving volunteers in decisions that affect them is not something that I did at the beginning of my career. It was an aha moment I had later on, when I kept having so many volunteers who were dissatisfied with their volunteer experience. And what I realized was I wasn't getting their input on a lot of the decisions that affected them. And I wasn't partnering with them truly. I wasn't involving them in the way that I was building and structuring my programs in support of them, right? I was taking a very paternalistic approach, thinking, as a lifelong volunteer, I must know what volunteers want. I mean, I'm in this career, I'm in this field, I must know what they want. Instead of asking, right? Instead of just pausing and stopping and asking what it is that they want. And that is part of how we live the value of respect through this principle of dignity. Inclusivity is another one so relevant today, which means that we encourage and we facilitate the participation of individuals from diverse backgrounds, perspectives, and abilities. Okay, and lastly is privacy. And when we think about privacy, we think about protecting the privacy of individuals and information that is considered confidential. So very familiar for a lot of us, this is like the nuts and bolts of what we do, right? Keeping good data and making sure it's private. And many of us have privacy guidelines of how things need to be password protected in databases, or paper needs to be stored away in locked cabinets. And that's very true. All of that is very important. But I want you to also think about, when we think about respecting people and we think about privacy, it's not just about what's on paper and information that people have provided to us in order to pass the screening process in order to volunteer. This is also about, and somebody mentioned this in our last mentee exercise, right? This is also about the information that volunteers share with us on a personal level. So I know that in my career working with volunteers, especially when I worked for a breast cancer charity, I often had volunteers with really close proximity to either they were survivors of breast cancer or they were watching a loved one go through what it's like to have breast cancer. And you often, are privileged when people will share really deep and personal and meaningful stories with you. That information also needs to be private, right? That's not information to be shared, with your colleagues. That's not information, to share, even at home with your spouse or anything like that. That's personal information. That's private information. And it just because it's not something that somebody wrote down, or put in their application form, and it's not something that you lock away in a filing cabinet. You lock it away in your heart, right? And that's information that you also need to keep private in thinking about dignity of your volunteers and respecting them as well. And so I think it's really important that we also do that. It also humanizes the volunteers that we work with, and really helps us to think of them each as individuals with their own stories, and just to be able to appreciate the diversity of people that come in our path, and that we get the opportunity and the privilege to partner with in service of our communities. All right, so next in craft is A for accountability. And that means that as leaders of volunteers, we demonstrate a responsibility to our organization, to its stakeholders, and that could be staff, volunteers, the community it serves, donors, funders, anything like that, but also to each other as a profession of volunteer administration. So we have accountability in many different ways. When we think about accountability, the principles that support it are collaboration. Okay, and what we mean by collaboration is that we include stakeholders in the development and support of volunteer engagement, and we cultivate partnerships to enhance the impact of volunteers. Okay, continuous improvement, an example of that is being here today, continuously improving on yourself as a professional, increasing your knowledge, increasing your skills as a practitioner and as a leader of volunteers, pursuing excellence in what you do by enhancing your professional competency, by maintaining certifications, like many of you who I mentioned before who are going to be taking the CVA exam in April, or many of you who have your professional credentials, and then fostering innovation as well, right? Being part of putting your hand up to say, I think there's a new way we could move forward, or I think there's a new way we could think about an old problem. And this is one of the most important parts, I think, of our professional ethics, because this is not something that often comes, when we talk about an ethical dilemma, it's not something that happens to us on a day-to-day basis, right? And ethical dilemmas are unique, and they should be few and far between. But your accountability, the idea of collaborating, continuous improvement, and professionalism is something that we can be working on a day-to-day basis, and we can relate that back to ethical practice as well. Lastly is professionalism, which means that we provide outstanding service to our organizations and the people that we serve, the communities that we serve, and that we uphold personal and professional boundaries while we do that as well. So we move on to the F in craft, which is fairness, which means that we commit to individual and collective efforts that build and support a fair and just culture, right? And the principles that support that, all very timely today, and a lot of the thinking that's happening, a lot of work that's happening in the charitable sector, and that is impartiality, equity, and justice. So impartiality means that we remain unbiased and objective when we work with stakeholders. Now, if you remember when we were talking about our ethics backpack and we talked about those personal ethics, those are very subjective. Our professional ethics are where that objectivity comes in, okay? And that's sometimes where those things can clash, where you can feel that uncomfortable rub, okay? Equity means that we are ensuring access to opportunities and resources and support, which enable volunteers to be successful. Super, super timely for today. And then lastly is justice, which means that we implement open and consistent processes that inform decision making and address any discriminatory or prejudicial behaviors. All right. So this is one that is something that we may be thinking of as leaders of volunteers and practitioners in this work, but a lot of our colleagues who are, for example, administering programs or running programs are also thinking of those things as well. So you shouldn't feel alone if you're going through, an ethical dilemma where one of these principles or values is where that rub is, that uncomfortable situation, or what's bringing up that ethical dilemma. And I say this because sometimes it can feel like we have to make the decision by ourselves. And it's always important to have a sounding board, to have a group of people that you can bounce ideas off of, because oftentimes the experience that you're having is not one that you're having alone. And it helps to know that there are other people who may feel the way that you felt, or have encountered a situation that you have, and you can learn from what they did well or mistakes that they made. That can always be really helpful. All right. So the last in our acronym of CRAFT is the T for trust. That means that we as practitioners are loyal and we have trusting relationships that we maintain with all of our stakeholders. Again, that could be staff, volunteers, community, donors. It can be anybody that we support in our work as leaders of volunteers. And that we remain dedicated to making sure we have safe environments based on established standards of practice. We do this with honesty. We commit to, with honesty, what we mean by that is we commit to the truth, and we strive for transparency in the work that we do. We use integrity, so we demonstrate a consistency between our words and our actions. And we practice ethical decision making when we address conflicts of interest. And then lastly is our commitment. So we act in a forthright manner with sincere good intent, and we follow through on promises and agreements that we make. Okay. I know that this has been a really quick introduction to the values and principles of our profession, and there's a lot to think about, but hopefully a lot of these words are familiar to you and they're not surprising to you. I hope you're comforted to know that a lot of these values, these principles, this language appears in the code of ethics for many of your colleagues who have their own code of ethics, and that's a good thing. Okay. Here and today, it's been tailored to the context in which we do our work. And before we move forward, one of the things I want to say is that I strongly, strongly encourage you to think about some future opportunities that you can create to walk through these professional values and principles with your peers, either with PAVRO, perhaps it's with your local DOVIA or AVA, or your local volunteer center. Perhaps it's a team of staff that you work with that all partner with volunteers together. Talk more about how each one of these relates to your work on the ground, and start building that sounding board for yourself, so that when there is an ethical dilemma that comes your way, you've got that group of people that you can go to and that you can connect with, but also so that you can be part of someone else's sounding board as well. And that's part of us living our ethical values. When we think about accountability and our accountability to each other as leaders of volunteers, it's a way for you to also step up and be part of someone's sounding board as well. Okay, I'm going to just stop real quick and just check if there's anything in the chat box before we move forward. Okay, looks clear. Okay, so I want to share a process next of what we go through when we are thinking of making an ethical decision. Before I do that, I want to remind you that not all difficult situations, or what we call them in our house with my little kids, is a yucky situation or a sticky situation. Not every uncomfortable decision or situation involves ethics. Okay. And it's very important for us to be able to determine when something is an ethical dilemma versus a management situation that has to be dealt with. Okay. So we have to keep in mind that an ethical dilemma has some very specific characteristics. Okay. So there's some questions that are on the screen. Is the situation unusual? Is there a conflict between values and beliefs? Are there multiple stakeholders involved? The policy said I should do A, B, and C, but I'm not sure. That doesn't feel right to me. Okay. And is there a downside to making the correct choice? Okay. So ethical dilemmas do have to have some very specific characteristics. They have to be rooted in a very specific context or situation. Okay. So if there's something that's happening for you on a daily basis, it's probably not an ethical dilemma. It's probably a management situation or a policy that is flawed or outdated that needs to be updated, or a procedure that is not well understood. There needs to be some more training, some more discussion about it. An ethical dilemma is not something that happens repeatedly. It is a situation that is very unique and it has a very specific context. Okay, so that's one way you know that you might be dealing with an ethical dilemma. The next thing is that it needs to deal with two or more values or ethical principles that are in conflict. Okay, the next thing is that it needs to involve the claims of multiple stakeholders. So it can't just be you looking at something, feeling a certain way about it. It has to actually have multiple stakeholders with different claims and different stances um, in order for it to qualify as an ethical dilemma. And then lastly, there's this policy that usually would be followed, or maybe a lack of a policy. Um, but where there is one, for some reason, it doesn't feel right in this situation. And you're getting those, like that little bubble over your head that says, yeah, but that's what's popping up for you. Okay. That's how you determine what is the difference. And that's how you would diagnose. Am I facing an ethical dilemma? Am I answering yes to any of these questions that are on the screen? If so, it's an ethical dilemma. If not, it's an unpleasant situation. It's a management issue. It's a flaw in policy, an outdated policy, and there's a difference there. And we can talk a little bit about what that nuance is and that difference is as we think about Lynn's case study that we visited at the beginning. All right, so when we are confronted with what feels like an ethical dilemma, this is the decision-making process that we recommend you go through. These 5 steps. So I want to start off by saying that, first of all, this process is not unique to CCVA or to the Professional Ethics and Volunteer Administration. You're going to find, similar processes with other professions when they talk about how they go through ethical decision making. And the reason for that is because it works. It's super simple. It's a process that is simple, it's succinct, and it really works. It helps you. There's a few reasons why this process is wonderful and helps and works and is shared by many professions. So one is that it promotes a fuller understanding of this situation. It avoids us reacting from that knee-jerk reaction. Okay, it avoids us reacting from a place where our personal ethics are leading the decision making, and our bias then comes into play. So it helps us in some way to remove our own personal biases as much as we can, and it forces us to pause and to take time and think before we take any action. The process also encourages creative thinking and multiple perspectives and multiple solutions to an issue. Okay, it also provides you, when you're going through this process, a safe way to make a decision without causing harm to anyone before you actually make the final decision. So you're able to test different ideas and think about different possible solutions before you cause harm to anybody and before you actually make that decision. And then lastly, and this is the piece that I think is really important, is that when you follow these steps and you come to a decision, you have a decision that's defensible. Okay. So if somebody questions your final action or your response to a situation, you get to present your rationale. You've gone through this process and you're able to present the rationale that you went through and why you went through it. Okay. So when you're confronted with a challenging ethical dilemma, it's natural. It's natural for all of us to want to have the single right answer. We want to have the right answer, and we want to do the right thing. But the reality is that every situation is unique. Every backpack that I carry or that you carry is unique. And so the course of action that I might take or that you might take might be different. There may be negative consequences that are unavoidable. All of this is okay when it comes to ethical decision making. When we're faced with an ethical decision making, another way to also think about it is it's a learning opportunity. It's an opportunity for us to exercise our moral courage in making an ethical decision. It's an opportunity for us to understand where there are gaps in understanding, where there may be gaps in process, where our biases may have led to us forgetting about a perspective that might be there. And so our goal is that we want to make the best decision. I want to make the best decision that I can make using the information that I have at the time that I'm making that decision. And I want to be clear and I want to be prepared for any potential negative fallout that comes from my decision. And when I'm clear in that, what I'm also clear in and what I understand is that perfection is not going to be an option. Okay. So if you are looking at ethical decision making process as a way that someone is going to tell you what the right answer is, that is not what ethics are. Your professional ethics do not dictate to you what the right answer is in a situation. They help you to guide and make a decision yourself. And that's something that I think that as leaders of volunteers, we need to be able to make these decisions on our own if we want to be seen as leaders, if we want that seat at the table, if we want people to have esteem and hold our profession in high profile. We are the ones that have to make those ethical decisions. Hey, Charmaine, thanks for joining us. If you could mute yourself, that would be great. We are the ones that have to make those decisions, and that is us exercising our leadership as well. That is what a leader of volunteers does. So when you're making an ethical decision, I want you to be okay with and own the fact that perfection is not always going to be an option. Not everyone is going to be happy with the decision that you make, and sometimes it's you that's not going to be happy with the decision that you have to make. All right, so let's go into this a little bit more. So when we're thinking about our decision-making steps, okay, the first thing that we're going to do is gather information, okay? So we are faced with an ethical dilemma. We're going to gather some information. I'm going to adjust here and get a bit comfortable. All right. So we're going to ask ourselves questions like, what led to this situation? Who's involved? What do I know? What don't I know? We are looking for evidence and not just hearsay. We are thinking about the unique situational context of what's happening, right? What's unique about this situation? What are all the perspectives of everybody who's involved? And are there any relevant policies that I need to help guide me in the decision that I'm going to make? So this is all the information that we're gathering for ourselves. Next, we need to determine what is the ethical issue. What is the conflict at the heart of the situation? Okay. We are going to go back to those craft, right? And the principles that support each of those CRAFT letters. And we're going to ask ourselves, what's the conflict? Who's going to be most affected by the decision that I'm going to make? Where is that uncomfortable rub or that feeling coming from? That, yeah, but like, where is that coming from? And this is when you have to be very clear in naming that, because it's important in you coming to a decision down the road, right? And it's also important when you're documenting it and when you're coming up with a defensible decision in the end. Okay. So you've got a ton of information. You've identified the ethical dilemma. You've identified 2 or more values or principles that are at the heart of the dilemma. And then the next thing you're going to do is you're going to explore various options and consequences. What if I did this? What if I didn't do that? Who's going to be affected? Who has the most to gain? You're going to ask yourself, are there any legal implications? Are there policy implications? What you're doing when you are exploring your various options and your consequences is really you're trying to answer the question, what's the path of least harm, right? Because rarely is nobody going to be harmed in some way. Someone's not going to get their way when there are multiple stakeholders involved, right? A decision is going to be made. People may have to compromise. Someone might get their way, someone might not. But what is the path of least harm? And when you're thinking about the pros and cons of all the options that you could take before you make your decision, you're asking yourself that for each of them, okay? Then you're going to make a decision and you're going to test it, okay? You're going to seek the path of least harm. We have a tool that I love, and you can use this in ethical decision making. You can also use this in like family conflict or when it's making a decision in another way, and it's called the click test, okay? So let me take you through the click test. It's one of my favorite things, and it really helps me when I have to look at a bunch of different options and a bunch of different routes forward. It helps me to go through each route and apply the click test to each one, okay? So when we're thinking about the click test, Another acronym, and CLIC stands for consequence, legal, image, culture, and not. So consequence is, so you're thinking, all right, I have three possible ways I can deal with this situation. For situation one, I'm thinking to myself, what is the consequence if I do this? If I go with this situation, who's going to benefit if I take this route, and who's going to suffer if I take this route? Am I okay with that? Okay. So you're thinking about the consequences. L is for legal, and you're thinking about what are the legal consequences if I do this? Am I okay with that? Will my organization be okay with that? Are there any legal consequences if I take this route? Okay. Then you're going to think about image, right? Am I going to be comfortable seeing this decision broadcast in the local paper or on the news? What if it becomes a meme on Instagram? People start doing TikTok reels about it. Am I going to be okay with that, right? Is this decision going to harm, or is it going to hurt our public image? Could it promote our public image, right? Could it do good things for our public image? And those are the things you're going to think about. Then you're going to think about culture. You're going to think about, does the decision support or damage your organization's culture or values? Okay. So you're going to think about the culture that your organization has put forward. That might mean that you're looking back to your organization's values, your organizational code of conduct. And you're going to ask, is this decision supporting that or damaging that? One of the things that I often say to leaders of volunteers is, in 2020, after George Floyd was murdered, many of our organizations put out statements, right? And they talked about their commitment to equity and to inclusion and to justice. And for many of us, there hasn't been a ton of action, right? That there's a beautiful intention that's there, but it hasn't resulted into action. Making an ethical decision sometimes is us putting those values and those statements into action. And so we can always, or sometimes, depending on the dilemma, not always, but we can sometimes tie our decision back to living the culture and the values of our organization as well. And so this is what we might be considering when we're considering one of our options. And then lastly is something I talked about earlier, which is that not. Okay, so K is for not. For you, it might mean sweating, it might mean being fidgety, it might mean getting really flush in the face. For me, it's that knot in my stomach. Does this action cause a knot in my stomach on a gut level and emotionally? If I told my partner about this, or my best friend, that I made this decision, would they approve? Would they be proud of me? Would they be disappointed in me? Would they agree or disagree? If I have a mentor, is this something that I would be comfortable talking to them about? This is what you're thinking about when you're thinking about that knot in your stomach. Okay. So you're using the click test when you're testing all the different methods, all the different ways in which you could come to the end, making a decision. And then your final step, right? You've gathered information, you've identified the ethical dilemma, you've explored what are all the different options that I could go through, what are the consequences. You've applied the click test to every single one of those. And then your last step is you act, right? You pick one of those routes, you act with confidence and with courage and with professionalism, and you understand that there might not be a 100% guarantee that you've made the right decision, but you're able to justify your actions because you have followed you have followed a thoughtful process, a rational process, and you've taken into the account all of the contents of your backpack. You've thought about your professional ethics, you've thought about your organizational ethics, and you've thought about your professional ethics as well in finally coming to a decision. And I mentioned this before, that acting with integrity when it comes to ethical decision making is something that takes exercise, right? It's exercising moral courage. And it's doing this on a regular basis because you don't know when an ethical dilemma is going to pop up for you. Okay. All right. So there's an amazing tool that we have, and Dean is going to pop a link to it in our chat box. And again, I'm going to send this to you after today's session along with the slides. You'll get the 2 handouts, and this is our decision-making worksheet. Okay. People often ask me, what do I do with the decision-making worksheet? I've got an ethical dilemma. What am I going to do with that decision-making worksheet? So the decision-making worksheet is there just to help you work through those decision-making processes. You're able to identify what the dilemma is, who the stakeholders are that are affected in your decision-making, and what are the core values that are in conflict. just going to say somebody is not on mute. And if you wouldn't mind muting yourself just for now while I'm speaking, and then we'll unmute and I'll get to talk in a little bit. So you want to use this handout to document everything, the stakeholders who are affected, the core values that are in conflict, and then you've got those columns there to write down what your possible actions are. What are the positive consequences? What are the negative consequences? Taking them all through the click test. This is also really helpful for you to go back to if you ever have to revisit a decision. To, if someone says, well, did you consider any other options? You can say, yes, I did. And, these are the ones that I had. It provides you with the language that you might need should you have to defend your decision. One of the things that I will say is whenever I've used this process, and I have used it quite a few times, I've never had to defend my decision, because in delivering what the decision is, I'm able to not only deliver the final decision, but also talk about the process I went through to come to that decision, right? And so I don't need to then go back and defend it because I've talked about the process that I've been through. But in case you're not able to do that, you have this documented, and you have it for you. I would keep something like this in your personal files. So I wouldn't keep them at work, for example. I'd take something like this at home and keep it with you. Just make sure you aren't documenting anybody's names or anything, because this is you as a professional on your own, going through this work. And if you ever have to revisit it later, say you're in another work context and a situation comes up again, you've got this to look back at and to refer to. And it's another way in which you can exercise your moral courage. So you've got that, and that's on our website. It's in the chat box, and it'll get emailed to you as well. So let's go back to Lynn. All right, we talked about Lynn at the beginning of the session. We had quite a few people who joined us after we first met Lynn, so I'm just going to recap that. Lynn is the director of volunteer services at a hospital. Lynn is a real person, and this is a real situation from the summer of 2021. She's been asked by senior management to run a COVID vaccine clinic for volunteers. It's based on her government's current phasing criteria, and vaccine supply is not guaranteed. So she's thinking about which volunteers meet the current age and medical criteria, and she's approached by the VP of development or fundraising. He instructs her to invite one of the hospital's largest donors, Mrs. Smith, to get vaccinated. Lynn comments that the clinic is for current volunteers, and the VP says Mrs. Smith has dedicated lots of time to causes on behalf of the hospital before, and the hospital can't afford to disappoint her. Lynn knows Mrs. Smith doesn't meet the current age requirement for vaccination. Lynn is unsure of Mrs. Smith's medical background. All right, really quick in the chat box, I want you to answer the question for me. What should Lynn do? So you heard about Lynn's situation. Some of you have heard about it now for the second time. What's your reaction, your initial reaction when you hear Lynn's predicament? What should Lynn do? So Charmaine says she's getting that knot. Charmaine up in Thunder Bay is getting that knot. Thank you, Charmaine. Yep, I get that knot too. All right, who else? What do you think Lynn should be doing? Dean says favoritism and jumping the queue, and Catherine says not give the vaccine. Not having a medical background could be harmful. And Barb says, as much as I wouldn't want to, I would do what the VP says. Yep. And Sadie says, I would have a conversation with Mrs. Smith explaining she has to wait. And hi, Sadie. Shannon in Toronto. Hi. Shannon says it's a unique scenario, so is an ethical issue. Very good, Shannon. And someone else says, start to gather more information about the situation. And Kim says, it's not fair, but more information is needed. All right. So if you remember, we talked about, and we've got, I think it's Sherry. That says what you do for one, you would need to do for all. But if you want me to do it, I will. That's what she's saying. I think it's Sherry Forsyth. Maybe it's not. Sorry if I'm messing up whose name that is. Angie says, have a conversation with the VP and explain the process. Ask more questions. Robin says, maybe the VP can arrange for the vaccine sometime besides the volunteer clinic. HP says, squeeze her in if possible, but reiterate that it's an exception. Heather says, Lynn should decline to include Mrs. Smith in the vaccine rollout with the VP until she gathers more info. Charmaine says, what could be the consequences to image, culture, and legal. So Charmaine's asking questions. Jill says, make sure my supervisor knows why I will say no. Nathan says, explore options and consequences. Ruth, outline the rules in writing and ensure that both yourself and the manager and Ms. Smith have the clinic requirements. Outline fairness and determine whether you are being directed. Follow direction, but cover yourself. Sadie says, ensure her turn will come soon. Thank you, thank you, thank you. Oh, and Graham says, in jest, now is the time to ask for a larger or second gift. And in Graham's defense, he's a CFRE, so I know why he's saying that. Hi, Graham. And Kim says, there were actually more stories in the papers about queue jumpers, so consider that image as well. And Kim, that is what played into Lynn's decision. So I'm glad you brought that up. Thank you, everyone, for jumping in. I wanted to read out all of your answers because I want to take us back to, do you remember when I talked about how some of us carry a backpack, a laptop case, a briefcase, a crossbody, a clutch. We all carry different things. We all carry different things. And as a result, we all have different reactions, right? So Charmaine was really quick with that not reaction. And then we had people that got really practical, that went right into the gathering information stage, right? Maybe their gut reaction didn't lead them. They were able to go right away into the professional mode. And then we had people who answered from an organizational context. And it's really important to acknowledge that each of us is going to approach Lynn's situation differently. And some of us did without even going through the process. Some of us had some ideas of what we might do going forward, or what our initial reaction might be. Okay, so let me take you through what Lynn did. Okay, so step one in the decision-making process is Lynn needed to gather information. Okay, so Lynn is saying, who is ultimately responsible for distribution of vaccines at the hospital? Remember, this was summer 2021. The vaccine was out. Everybody who wanted to get a vaccine wanted to get it now. Some people were cool to wait and let frontline workers get it. Some people wanted to get back to life as they knew it, and they wanted to jump the queue, as Kim mentioned. Things were happening fast and furious, and not everyone had the time to write everything down, right? So Lynn is asking, who is ultimately responsible? Are there clear guidelines for distribution? She also wants to find out, has this colleague of mine, have they discussed this request with anyone else, right? Do they know that maybe they're trying to pull one over on me, or do they have approval from someone else where it's not actually my decision in the end anyways, right? So she wants to find that out as well. Lynn wants to find out, all right, what happens if you prioritize someone like Mrs. Smith based on something other than the established criteria, like her proximity to wealth, right, and her ability to give as a donor. And Lynn is also thinking about, who are all the stakeholders that I need to consider when I'm making this decision, right? So there's the hospital, there's the CEO and the board of directors. There are the volunteers that are going to be in the clinic, getting the vaccine, not getting the vaccine. There is the community at large, and there is Lynn. And there's a question about when is the end time. We're ending at 10:30 Pacific time, which I think is 1:30 Eastern time. So this is what Lynn is doing in the gathering info stage, okay? Second, she is identifying the conflict, okay? So she wants to know what makes this an ethical dilemma, so then I can then use that to guide my process going forward. So for her, the core values at the heart of the dilemma are fairness. So it's a question of equity and justice for her, and trust, right? It's her integrity and her principle and value of trust and integrity are coming to play. And then also possibly, and Kim alluded to this in the chat box, accountability and professionalism. There's a lot of other directors of volunteers in the hospital sector who have been put through the ringer through COVID, right? They've been redeployed, they've been shuttered, they've been having to mobilize volunteers back again really quickly. They've had to wear many different hats during the pandemic. But they're also connected and accountable to each other. And so she knows that the decision that she makes may affect other people as well outside of the hospital. So for Lynn, the main conflict is that she's being asked to give preferential treatment to someone that is based on their financial contributions and not their eligibility for the actual clinic that she's running. And she is being asked to inconsistently apply the rules. So she uses that moving forward. And if that's what the conflict is, then this is how she's going to move forward and make the decision. Okay. So she comes up with 5 possible actions and outcomes. So first, she could invite Mrs. Smith to the clinic. Maybe Mrs. Smith gives a large donation afterwards, right? That would make Graham very happy, I know, and any other fundraising or development professionals in here. She could invite Mrs. Smith to the vaccination clinic, and she doesn't give a large donation. She starts telling all her other donor friends, and word spreads, and that becomes another issue. Um, Lynn could connect with Mrs. Smith and ask her if she meets the current criteria. Maybe there's something about Mrs. Smith that Lynn doesn't know. Maybe Mrs. Smith meets the criteria, so she includes her. Lynn says, nope, not inviting Mrs. Smith. She doesn't meet the criteria that's been set out for me. And a consequence is that she makes the VP angry and she faces the consequences. And you remember when I said to you that when you make the decision, it's not perfection that you're going to be able to achieve, right? So she makes a decision that in this route she would feel good about, but it's not perfect because she could be antagonizing and isolating herself from a colleague. She could also decline to invite Mrs. Smith, right? She stands firm in what she thinks is, no, I'm not going to invite her. She doesn't meet the criteria, but the VP could invite her anyways. Okay. So let me tell you so then what Lynn did is she took each of these 5 possible actions and outcomes. She ran all of them through the click test, and then she made a decision. Okay. Charmaine says in the chat box, maybe Mrs. Smith doesn't even want to jump the queue or jump the line. And she even realizes that and doesn't even realize that someone has used their position to advocate for her expedited vaccination. And that's great, Charmaine. Like in the decision-making process and the gathering info stage, that might also be something that Lynn wants to know. So what we do know, and what we do know that Lynn did in the end, is Lynn decided not to invite Mrs. Smith to the vaccine clinic. She met with the VP, and she took him through her situation. And she's like, you know what, Mrs. Smith, I get why you want to invite Mrs. Smith, right? That's one of your really important stakeholders. I understand why it's important for you to invite Mrs. Smith. What you need to understand is I have this mandate that's been set for me about running the clinic and what the requirements are. A, Mrs. Smith doesn't meet those requirements. And B, Lynn was really lucky in that she was able to point to some news stories that had been happening about medical professionals who were waiting. And there was a story like this in Ontario as well, with some pharmacists and some medical professionals who had been waiting until the end of the shift, and they didn't want to waste any vaccines. And so they were calling in family or friends to come in and get vaccinated, whoever they could reach. And they just didn't want the vaccine to get wasted. But because of the supply and the demand of the vaccine at that time, they were heavily punished, and it was bad PR for them. Some people lost their jobs over this, and it was an issue of equity and fairness around who has access to the vaccine, who has access to distributing the vaccine, and who has access to those people. And that whole issue of equity came into play then. The wonderful thing that came out of this was that Lynn was able to act with that courage and with that professionalism. She was able to present her information without fear, without trembling in her voice, and have a great conversation with that VP of development. And she ended up really building a good relationship with a colleague in her organization who was higher in the hierarchy than she was. And she ended up having a great ally and a great champion of volunteerism and of leaders of volunteers as a result of going through the process, arriving at a decision, and then being able to articulate why she came to that decision, the consequences of making other decisions as well. And so Lynn was, in effect, signaling, right, to her colleague who has his own code of ethics when it comes to fundraising, that I am a professional with my own code of ethics, and this is how I'm choosing to move forward. Okay. So it ended up being a good situation for Lynn. And we talked about it not being 100% perfect for everyone, because that VP had to then go back to Mrs. Smith, who, by the way, had asked, can I squeeze myself in there and get a vaccine? I heard you were doing one, a clinic. And so he had to go back to that donor and have an uncomfortable conversation. But that's fine, right? You can't make everybody happy, and you're not going for perfection with the decision that you make. Okay, so that is, if we think about the case study of Lynn and you think about the decision making process that she went through, and you think about how she was able to act with confidence and with courage and with professionalism, that is what I was speaking about earlier in the webinar. That's the moral courage, right? And moral courage, I'm going to take a minute to read out what's on the slide here. It's the quality of mind and spirit that enables one to face up to ethical dilemmas and moral wrongdoings firmly and confidently without flinching or retreating. Okay. It's hard work, right? I'm talking about Lynn like it was no big deal, but when Lynn was in that situation, she was already in enough of a stressful situation, right? She, like all of us, had been living through the pandemic, personally and professionally, and going through what many of us had to go through. But she was on the ground, working full time, running a COVID vaccination clinic, wearing so many different hats, and was able to, I'm sure Lynn had moments where she wanted to flinch and where she wanted to retreat, but she had learned the skill and the process of ethical decision making. So she's able to build that moral courage within herself, have that confidence needed to navigate this dilemma that happened to her. And to make a decision with that courage and that confidence and that professionalism, and then move forward with that as well. Okay. So we need to remember that moral courage is something we all need to build up. We can't pass the decision off to our supervisor. We can't, like, it's not for me to decide, I'm too low on the totem pole. If we want to say that we are leaders of volunteers, when something like this happens, we need to demonstrate what it looks like to be a leader and a leader in action. We can use this process from our professional ethics to help us to do that and to build that moral courage. So when we talk about exercising ethics, just as we sort of end up, there are a few things you can do to exercise your ethics. So you can post the CCVA values and principles near your desk. I have them near my desk, which is in a different space, but they're just kind of always in my eyesight. That CRAFT, that craft acronym is always there. Just kind of always in the back of my mind, even if it's not something where I'm, coming across an ethical dilemma all the time. You might want to talk about ethics at your staff orientations or volunteer orientations, and talk about the process for reporting and handling unethical behavior. For some of us who might work in the healthcare sector, you may have an ethicist on staff, you may have a department of ethics on staff. If they're not aware of our professional ethics and volunteer administration, make them aware, right? Let them know that as part of the hospital community and the hospital ecosystem, also have professional ethics that you follow. You might want to develop your own case studies within your organization that you revisit or you talk about with your team, and use those as a discussion starter and practice the decision-making process with a group of people. You'll see just from the chat box how many different solutions and things we came up with. And now imagine if all of us were to get together and then run all of those things through the click test. What decisions might we make and go forward on? It's always better to have a diversity of opinion and input when you're going through an ethical dilemma. You might want to devote time at staff or board meetings, and you definitely want to find colleagues to serve as your sounding board. And I put up my hand here and say, if you don't have those colleagues and you run into an ethical dilemma, then I will be part of your sounding board. If you need someone to connect, also be able to support you through that. All right, lastly, if you're as excited about ethics and volunteer administration as I am, and hopefully you can see that I'm enthusiastic about it, because I really do feel like this is something that professionalizes and legitimizes and gives credibility to what we do as leaders of volunteers. You can do some further research, and we've got resources on our website, which is listed here. In the US, the independent sector, on their website in the resources section, if you search ethics and accountability, they have a bunch of resources there. The Josephson Institute of Ethics that I talked about, that CCVA, AVA and CCVA used to develop their ethics, as well as what other professions use as well, is on this slide as well. And there's also a really cool toolkit. So if you are a part of a group of managers, for example, people who manage different teams, it's called the Complete Guide to Ethics Management, an ethics toolkit for managers. It's not specific to leaders of volunteers, but it's a free 20-page booklet. You can Google it. And as a management team, it's something you might want to work through together, to think about your organizational ethics, your personal ethics, and your professional ethics as well. So I hope that in going through, understanding the core values and principles of the professional ethics of volunteer administration, in going through the decision-making process, including that click test, which is so important to use, and in having that the decision-making process and a way to document it, that you hopefully feel a little bit more confident and like a little bit more about our professional ethics, and are more confident articulating them and understanding how to apply them moving forward. If you have questions about ethics, you can reach me, and I'd be happy to be part of your sounding board or talk to you more about ethical dilemmas. My email address is on the screen, and the CCVA website is on the screen as well. So with that, Dean, I'll turn things back over to you, and I'll thank everyone for taking time out today and joining me today. And I think we have a couple minutes for questions. If anyone has a question, I'm going to stop sharing here.
I wanted to say ethics, we can see is not an easy subject to convey, and the clash between the subjectivity of personal ethics and the objectivity of professional ethics is itself sufficient evidence of the potential complexity in this subject. We've been blessed to have Faiza bring these dynamics to the fore in a very comprehensible and sensible presentation. It was truly golden, Faiza. On behalf of our president, Heather Johnson, the PAVRO leadership, and all of our wonderful members, all of whom are celebrating 25 years of PAVRO, thank you so much. We also express our collective gratitude on behalf of all of our friends here today who joined us from all over the continent. Thank you, Faiza. I defer to our president, Heather Johnson, for a closing message as we watch for questions that might come.
Thank you, Dean. Thank you, Faiza. What a great presentation. Thank you to everyone for attending. It's always a really great opportunity to walk through these types of ethics conversations. The toolkits are fantastic, and you will receive all of the toolkits. I did see a question pop up in the chat about if the slide deck's going to be available, and I apologize, I wasn't at the beginning of this, but I'm seeing nods, so that is going to happen, which is fantastic. So yes, again, thank you so much for being here. For those that are pursuing their examination in April, good luck. And for those who are preparing to submit your application to pursue your examination in October, good luck. And consider, if you are not a member of PAVRO, to contact us, because we have an opportunity to offer you a discount on the examination. And PAVRO also has a partnership with Volunteer Toronto, delivering a CVA study group, which is open very widely across Canada, and we have a couple of participants right now in the United States. We'd love to have you be part of that. We have some fantastic discussions where we can dive into some of these issues a bit deeper and learn from each other, which is always important. Faiza, thank you so much for making time for us today. It's good to see you, and don't tell us how warm it is in California, because it's not terribly warm here.
It's not terribly warm here, Heather. It's just been a rainy week, but it's so good to see my 416-905 colleagues and everyone in Ontario. I miss all of you. And when I tell people in California I'm from Ontario, they think I'm from like the town of Ontario, which is like an hour away from where I live, and have to correct them that I'm sure it's a great town, but it's nothing like Ontario, my Ontario.
All right. So if you've got Faiza's info, send her the photographs. If you have snow outside your window, maybe. We've seen pictures of Faiza and her kids on the beach, so let's we will exchange those pictures. But again, thank you so much, Faiza, for making the time for us today. Thank you to everyone for being here today. If you are part of the CVA study group, we're going to be tackling the ethics question in next week's session, and we will